We are going live and looks like everybody's joining. Hi, my name is Margarita Roche. I am the CEO and founder of MK Medical Solutions. And our mission is very simple. We simplify and humanize health policy. And my personal mission is to propel behavioral health adoption in a way where the words mental health are no longer perceived with an implicit bias, regardless of where you work or live. Over the course of the past several weeks, we've been on a journey of a wonderful discussion of a book club where we've been discussing this brilliant work. Is Zoom gonna let me show it? Well, all of you guys know what this is. This is What Happened to You, co-authored by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. So a little bit of background about Dr. Perry. He is the principal of the Sequential Network, senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy, and a professor of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine in Northwestern University in Chicago, and the School of Allied Health, College of Science, Health and Engineering, La Trobe University, Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. His career spans over 30 years as an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and the neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. He has co-authored 2 best-selling books, including The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, with Maria Selavis, I apologize for mispronouncing that, and our book of What Happened to You, co-authored with Oprah Winfrey. And without further ado, we have Dr. Perry here with us, and I will just ask folks a few house cleaning rules. Everybody is muted, but if you can, we'd love to engage and see you. If you're in a place where we can see your face, please, by all means, take off let us see the camera and let us see you, because of course, talking to folks and seeing folks' interaction and engagement is always a lot more open, and it just creates for a much more engaging conversation. So Dr. Perry, thank you for being here with us and for honoring us with your time. I know our conversation is going to be brief. We have half an hour with you. Thank you so much on behalf of Therapist Toolbox and Therapist Book Club and the whole entire Mentally Fit community. Your time is very honored by all of us.
Well, thank you for asking me, and I'm always flattered that people have read the book and are interested in having some conversation. So I'm all ears. I'm ready to start talking all about
Perfect.
the book.
Well, the very first question is kind of in the title. Why is it important to reframe away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you?
Well, it's interesting. Lots of people who are in the mental health world and have heard Sandy Bloom or people from her workshop and people that know Sandy and her work know that she's been using that phrase for quite a while to really articulate a shift into a more developmentally attuned process by which you'll understand how experiences impact the developing person. And Sandy talks a little bit about the origin of that phrase in one of her staff meetings, where they were really kind of acknowledging finally that that they're really focusing on trauma, that the key question isn't like, what's the list of the problems that you have? And in other words, what's wrong with you? But really, what happened to you? We need to get a good developmental history. And so I think for me, being a developmental neuroscientist, before I became a clinician, I'd always kind of had the mental approach that the present functioning is always informed by the antecedent processes. And so even before I became a neuroscientist, I was interested in history. So same thing with history. History tells us about the current times. And so I think the same principles apply to individuals, that your current thinking, feeling, behaving, worldview, beliefs, the way you parent, the way you interact with other people comes from someplace. And if you understand where it comes from, then you have a much better understanding about, things that might inform the present decision-making process. And that's kind of why we wrote this book, to help, just to make that tiny little shift in perspective that we think can really influence the way we can be more curious and compassionate, as opposed to judgmental and punitive, which is unfortunately what happens a lot with people judging individuals who are struggling.
Thank you for that. That's a very profound answer. Well, what advice do you have for therapists in guiding their patients in understanding PTSD and traumatic responses?
I'm always all about getting to know who you're working with, get to know their story, where they come from, how'd your family end up there. It's interesting. I've done a lot of research, and as you all know, when you do research, one of the things you want to do is have a systematic process by which you gather information. And so I've done lots of semi-structured interviews. And after a while, when I was first learning, I realized that, I'm really not listening to people when I have what I want to ask, as opposed to what they want to tell. And so I learned to just get very comfortable with the ambiguity of getting the answers I was interested in, and let that go and just get to know somebody, and trust that process would result in a natural emergence of the key problems, the key issues, the key life events that would be more traditionally in line with a mental health assessment. So I found literally that the first visit, if you can make somebody feel comfortable, help them get, really show interest in who they are and how they got here, and that it makes the therapeutic process just a lot easier. And, we actually, our working group has a lot of metrics, but I always tell people, don't fill the metrics out until you get to know somebody, and take the time to get to know them. And then filling out the metrics, that part's really easy once you know them. So I think about how many times as a clinician that you've been working with somebody and you kind of did the intake, right? And then 6 months later, you start to get these pieces of history. You're like, oh my God, I didn't realize that you had a twin sibling that died when you were 4. Like, where was that? And it comes with trust, right? So what all clinicians know, all therapists know, that once that connection is created and you feel safe with somebody, then things come forward more easily. And I just found that when you start that up front, if you depend upon having that grow hour by hour by hour, week after week after week, it's week 10, 12 before you start to get into some really deep stuff. But if you just relax into the process of getting to know them, you get to really important concepts and experiences quicker. So I'm just rambling. Sorry. You got to cut me off.
Definitely not.
Stop me. No. Stop me before I talk again.
Will not do that, because everything that you're sharing is definitely very insightful. So I kind of have a follow-up to that. What do traditional therapy models get wrong about helping us heal from trauma?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the traditional models get a lot right, but they do get some things wrong. So like TFCBT, for example, one of the things that it gets right is that in the end, it really will be helpful for the person to revisit the experience in a controlled, safe way in context of a real therapeutic relationship. What it gets wrong is that process really needs to be dosed and guided by the client and not by the therapist. And anybody who's ever had to deal with stress, distress, or trauma of their own, that, there are times you just don't want to talk about it. And there are times when you don't want to talk about that part of it. And there are days when like you really do want to talk about it and you want to talk with this specific person about this part of it. And so we all manage and sort of process our challenging things by sometimes talking to a friend and then talking to a partner and then talking to somebody else. And over the course of a week, we may have said, we may have talked about some incident at work 12 different times, but we talk about it in different ways, different duration, different focus. And by the end of the week, we feel better about it. But when if somebody said, all right, sit down now and tell me about what happened at work, and it would feel completely different than kind of that little dosing that we do when we control it. And I think that somehow we have to figure out a therapeutic process that's more tolerant of short visits. And I think COVID's helped that. I think we are working with more and more people who are now comfortable with a 15-minute check-in, or let me talk to you a couple times a week, and we'll do a little work, and just want to see how you're doing, check in. You may find that a lot of the stuff goes faster with that kind of dosing than the traditional come to my office every Wednesday at 4 thing. And so that's the kind of thing we've been doing. We've been experimenting with dosing and scheduling. And now we have the luxury of doing it in part because we've sort of stepped outside of the traditional medical economic model. We don't get paid for what we do. We just do it. But we're hoping to learn things that will ultimately be able to convince at least elements of the medical economic model that this is a more cost-effective way to do this work. That if you really want to diminish hospitalizations and really expensive things, let your clinicians do work this way. Let them get paid for things like going to talk to the teacher or doing psychoed for the parent, or things that help you do the work you want to do. But right now, I think the medical economic model really shackles people to a certain style of practice.
Well, and with that, I'm happy that you mentioned that, because this is Therapist Toolbox. So the folks that are a part of this community, they are LCSWs, LMFTs, licensed mental health counselors, and then the 9 different variations or the 10 different variations of what an LMHC is, depends on which state you're in. So Medicare doesn't recognize LMHCs or LMFTs. And as we're coming out of the pandemic, as it's the same soapbox that I go on very often, but the fastest growing population is the aging population. With everything that we know about what you just said about the, a non-sustainable healthcare model system that we have, how can we better prepare, short of, shaking our political leaders and saying, please acknowledge their existence and allow them to bill for services, because if you don't, you're going to see an increase in your ER continue to rise. How do we bridge that dialogue short of, lobbying more with our associations? What needs to happen so that we could have a pathway to make a better system?
Yeah. I'm actually working on another book right now. Really about systems and why systems are so hard to change, and why even in the face of high quality evidence, systems won't change their paradigm. Because it's really confusing to me. I started out as a young, energetic faculty member, and I remember the first time I told the judge, I'll just teach you a little bit about trauma and you'll do the right thing, right? Because it's like, once you know this, of course you're going to do the right thing. And I was just shocked that systems don't change easily, and they don't change in the face of factual content. So I think part of what's going to have to happen is, and I think COVID actually might be part of the motivation for this. I think that systems require some sort of external crisis to kind of get pushed out of their internal sort of equilibrium, where they really don't care that much. But when the mental health needs of so many people go unmet,
Mhm.
I think that we have to start looking at alternatives to the way we've been doing things. And one of the things that we've done, I mean, we try to talk about this a lot, is that therapeutic experiences are, you don't have to be a therapist in an office to provide a therapeutic experience. And there are lots of people that have tremendously therapeutic capabilities who are underutilized, underappreciated, and certainly underpaid.
Mhm.
And I think that we just have to help. I think that the concept of what therapy is needs to start to shift so that people will be willing to say, this person may not have all of the behavioral science credentialing that a doctoral level person does, but because they work in, they're good with animals, they know how to do animal assisted work, they understand the core principles of creating a safe environment for kids, and there are therapeutic effects of being with these animals, that we should pay them for that. But it's, and we've been able to do that in some communities, but other communities, they're just like, across the board, no. So I
Okay.
think you have work. I mean, honestly, I do think that advocacy helps,
Mhm.
but I don't think it helps quickly. I hate
No,
to say that. So
it doesn't. So help us understand, you talk about this a lot, and not just in the book, but I mean, in your work, help us understand the neurosequential network.
well, you mean the community we have that?
Yes. Mhm.
So about 10 years ago, the work that we'd been doing, I finally sort of, I'd been teaching about it and talking about it a lot, and we had a pretty big clinic that was doing therapeutic work using this approach. And at some point, it's a long story, but ultimately I decided that we needed to have some sort of certification process to teach people in a systematic way how to use these tools, how to use this approach. And so we developed the certification process. And then and we really didn't expect it to kind of blow up the way it did, but we started to teach individuals, but also there were a number of organizations that wanted to bring the model into their mental health setting or day hospital setting or residential treatment setting. And so little by little, we started to get this accumulation of people that really were using this frame of reference. And we added in the neurosequential model in education because it was clear that you could be a great clinician, a great clinical team, and work with a really good family, and you all could be on the same page and be doing the right things. And then Billy would go to school and they would completely misunderstand him. And, they wouldn't recognize that his attentional challenges would get better if you let him walk around or let him get regulated, do some of these things. They're like, oh no, this kid has ADHD. He needs to be on Ritalin, blah, blah, blah. And so once we brought the educational community in, then we realized it was sort of like redecorating a house. You kind of, once you go, wow, we're really good at making windows, and you make a really nice window, and then you go, oh, our walls really suck, so we need to make walls. And then you go, oh, I've got to redo the floor. So that's what's been happening with the model, that we recognize these concepts are helpful in a lot of different arenas, whether it's parenting or coaching or teaching or doing therapeutics, that we've kind of responded to the community saying, we need to have a neurosequential model for this. And I'm like, oh God, all right, let's talk about how to do that in a systematic way where there's some coherence between these different models. And we've done that pretty well. And over the years, I mean, we've ended up with like 27 different countries have clinicians and organizations, and thousands of practitioners. And part of the NMT, the metrics we use are web-based. So everybody who does an assessment, part of what the certification process teaches you a little bit about how to use the tools. And then when you do use the tools with an assessment of a client, that goes into a core data set. And then that data set can be used for de-identified aggregate analysis. And so we have a data set that's got 90,000 cases. So it's probably the biggest well-characterized group of individuals that have some form of trauma in the world. And we're now parsing it out and starting to publish about it. And we're learning a lot. So
thank you.
And so the network is really all of these people and organizations that are involved in that.
And for folks are, of course, encouraged to check out Dr. Perry's website to learn a little bit more about this. I want to take us back to not so long ago, to the events of 2020. So how can we explain the importance, the urgency of the BLM movement to folks who don't necessarily understand the inherited sense of fear? In the book, you and Oprah had a conversation, and there was a comment like, well, there was never the N-word used in the house, but then if you see how folks interacted and acted and discussed towards folks that are not of the same pigment or the same social status class, or alternatively, right now, there's still consistent and ongoing misunderstanding of that movement. So how do we explain the importance and what drove it to those who don't really understand it or the inherited sense of fear?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Thank you.
So let me say this first of all. One of the things that I think we did pretty well in the book was try to talk about the reality of implicit bias and parse it away from racist ideologies, because racist ideologies is kind of an easy, if you're taught these racist things, it's kind of that's an easy thing to understand. A lot of people get completely upset and defensive and confused about implicit bias. And so what I felt really good when I got an email from a police officer in LA who said he's been through dozens of trainings about bias and Black Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff. And he said he was so happy to read this book because it was the first time he understood what they were talking about. And he didn't feel like he was being attacked as a racist. He said the explanation was so helpful that this is the way we should teach this to people in law enforcement. And honestly, that was part of the objective of this book, is that with very emotionally charged content, whether it's individual trauma or, implicit bias or whatever it is, if you can sort of step away from it enough and then explain a little bit about the mechanism, it makes it less, it makes it easier to understand for people, and it makes you feel more understanding, I think. And I hope that the people that read what we wrote in there realizes that everybody has some kind of implicit bias based upon their life's experience. And that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that, if you want to be a reflective person, think about the way you grew up. And you'll recognize that you got a couple of little landmines in your own history that might get in the way of the way you get along with a certain, style of interacting at work. Or you might have certain landmines for people that are, well, you were a jock, and these things in really, sometimes in innocent ways follow us forward, but sometimes in toxic ways. But once you start to understand it, I think that it's easier to begin to address it in a non-judgmental way. But I had a conversation literally, I was on a call like an hour ago, and we were talking about how do we get systems to change, and how do we get the public to sort of incorporate new ideas. And I think that I think there's two things that we really need to do. One is that we need to take a lot of these core concepts and put them into public education so that they're not, so everybody who grows up understands a little bit about how the brain works. And so the concept of state-dependent functioning, which is like at play in everybody's life, one way or another, the way when you come home and you're tired and angry and upset, you interact differently than you do when you're regulated and calm. And the concept of sequential processing, which explains a lot of behaviors. And if we teach that in school, no matter what you become, you'll have a better understanding of the way the world works and the way people work. And then now that's the long-term solution. The shorter-term solution, and this is the way I think most people learn, is through stories. So we have to get this content into our storytelling mechanisms, soap operas, comedies on TV, movies, et cetera, et cetera. And this actually happened with HIV/AIDS, that when the Hollywood writers, they got together and they said, listen, we want the public to understand HIV/AIDS in a better way. They wrote all kinds of stuff into comedies, soap operas, movies, and everything else. And the public opinion and awareness about these things shifted faster than any other topic in the history of public health. So that's what we have to do. And fortunately, that's something that Oprah is aware of. And there are people in her sphere of influence who are thinking very intentionally about how do we tell stories that teach these concepts. And so I think that those are the two, hand in hand, those two mechanisms I think will really help people internalize this stuff in a better way.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to make sure that we have, and I have 3 more questions I want to ask you. I mean, I have a lot more than that, but we only have you for
You can
another
see
5
why
minutes.
people in the press always say, can you say that again, but in 10 seconds?
Well,
I'm not good at sound bites.
So here's one of the questions that I would love you to address is, since we are at a mentally fit community doing this talk, we always like to ask, what does it mean to you to be mentally fit?
Oh, that's actually a good question.
And remember, I still have 3 more questions.
Yeah. Well, for me, being mentally fit, the best reflection, I think, of being a mentally fit person is a person who's able to be compassionate and kind to others. And so you can have I know people that have schizophrenia who are, I would say, you're mentally fit. Even though they have struggles in one area, they're still kind, compassionate people. And I think that that's your ability to view another person in a positive way and to connect with them and demonstrate kindness and understanding. That's what mentally fit is. So you can have all kinds of, what we would call mental health issues, but still be mentally fit, in my mind.
Right. Thank you for that, because I know that a lot of folks would love that explanation and then your insight on that. So I know that you're not a fan of this term. So instead of trauma-informed care, are there better terms we should start integrating into our vocabulary? What are they?
Right. So here's the dilemma, and I can talk to you guys about this because you see this at play all the time. One of the tendencies of the human brain is to put things in boxes, and we do that with everything, right? You're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're this, you're that, and the reality is we are much more than any of those labels. And so when people started to use trauma informed, it became a bucket for me that people dumped all kinds of crap into it. That literally, believe it or not, there's a 1-hour training in the NFL that the NFL claims that we're now trauma informed, which is like nuts, right? So what I want people to try to do is to try to keep resisting bucketing, resist labeling. Just describe what you do. We're compassionate, we're kind, we try to be culturally sensitive, we try to do this. If somebody wants to call that trauma informed, great, but describe it and then live it. And there's just too many box checking things going on in some of our systems when they're trying to attract resources or money. Now that trauma informed has money connected to it, everybody is a self-declared expert, and they're happy to sell their services to an organization that wants to check the box.
Mhm.
And there's this weird collusion that basically deflects people from the real work. And I think that happens with a lot of stuff. It's happening with culturally relevant. Okay, we're going to be sort of anti-racist. And there's people that have, it's a cottage industry.
Right.
So just tell me what you're doing. It's just like somebody comes, when I meet somebody, I don't want to give you a label. I want to get to know you. I don't care. They'll come and say, oh, I'm bipolar. I go, what is that? I don't care. So where were you born? Tell me about your life. What do you like to do? You know, do you like the Cubs? If not, we can't work together. I'm just kidding. But, you know.
It's about to be fixed. But no, it's a very valid point. So I'm going to ask one more question before Dan rejoins us. Will we ever come to terms on a definition for trauma? And if we will, what needs to happen for us to have one definition for that term? Is it even a possibility?
You know, that's a really good question, because that very issue kind of got in the way of the adoption of a developmental trauma label for the last DSM cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think a lot of different bodies have sort of convened and talked about what is trauma. I think, you know, over time, excuse me, I've been talking all day. I think over time, different groups and this is just human nature, different groups are going to settle on different variations of similar definitions. And we're just going to have to live with it. And then the people like me who really want to get to know what we're looking at are going to say, all right, let's parse that out. What do you mean by that? Like, okay, whatever, you can say we're measuring trauma, but let's look at let's look at this. Are we looking at microaggressions? Are we looking at the timing of them? Are we looking at being a minority in a majority culture? Are we looking at, you know, domestic violence? You know, that's what I want to know. And you can call it whatever you want, but I know that these things do something to the stress response system. And so I'm a describer rather than a clumper, if that makes any sense.
It does. Well, I have, of course, about 20 more questions that I want to ask you, but I will not, because I will honor your time and boundaries of everybody. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody who joined the conversation. And we love having you here. Please feel free to pop into our Facebook group, Therapist Book Club. And you could actually probably see the questions when you go in that we've been asking and the discussions that have been taking place there. And actually, to all the participants, I encourage you to go back to the book club and take a look at the questions that have been posted and engage, because whether or not you finished reading the book already, or, you know, engage, because that's how you learn. You talk amongst each other and you learn, and you create a community where we can drive conversation and propel success and healing. And that's why we're here, right? To be mentally fit and to have a conversation where we could all support each other. So again, on behalf of MK Medical Solutions, on behalf of Therapist Toolbox, on behalf of Mentally Fit, on behalf of everybody who has read your book, thank you so much for the work you do. And just a truly wonderful discussion. And I see that folks are hitting up the chat, private and in public chat, and everybody seems to be very, very wonderful responding to your insights. So thank you so much. What's the name of your new book, by the way?
It doesn't have a name yet. It might be What Happened to Us, but
oh.
We'll see. We'll see.
Wonderful. Well, we will keep an eye out for it, and then maybe we'll have you back after we're done with that one.
All right. And listen, I appreciate that you all read the book. You know, I know that it's time and energy, and I hope it's helpful. So
it's definitely been very
helpful. Keep up your good work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. And thank you, everybody. Be well, stay safe, be happy, be productive, and take it easy on yourself.